A response to Sean McDowell. The Bible was written by random dudes. I was watching Pinecreek yesterday, and it seemed to me that his show was more like the old format of his show, which I actually prefer. In the old format of his show, he would review videos put out by Christian apologists and critique them, and this is what he was doing last night. What I would suggest to Pinecreek is spend the first hour critiquing apologists' videos and then invite people into the chat. It can be a bit annoying whenever Doug is reviewing a video and when this is interrupted by somebody ringing in. His conversations very often are of mixed quality, although some of his conversations are fascinating. However, I wish he would do more of his old style videos where he would take a video by an apologist and critique it. The video yesterday that he was critiquing was a video by Sean McDowell, who I think flew out to Taiwan to attend an apologetics conference. He was being interviewed by students, and they treated him as though he were a rock star, as though his stale apologetics were brilliant. He would get rounds of applause, he would get boisterous laughter, and it was quite bizarre to watch. However, in fairness, I do not think that Sean McDowell lost his head. I think Sean McDowell was well aware that he was being interviewed by essentially school children, and that this success ought not to go to his head. I think that Sean McDowell is one of the more cynical apologists, and I think that Pinecreek Doug also suspects this. I suspect that deep down Sean McDowell does not believe in really any of this. It is a lucrative grift. He is getting paid huge money to be a professor in Biola University. Digital Gnosis did a show on, it was entitled Bad Apologetics, the apologetics industrial complex, and you would not believe the money that is being sunk into Biola. So Sean McDowell is making huge sums of money, and in my view that's the reason why he is still a Christian, still an evangelical, and still an apologist. It pays his bills. Sean McDowell recently had some health problems, and because Sean McDowell lives in a hyper-capitalist dystopia, unless you have money, you cannot afford good healthcare. So apologetics means that he is insured. Apologetics means that he can probably send his children to private schools. Apologetics means that if he gets sick, then he can go to the doctor and get treatment. And so, in my view, this is why he's an apologist, this is why he is a Christian, this is why he I don't think he really believes in it. I could be wrong about that, but and also he's trading on his father's name. His father, Josh McDowell, is evangelical royalty. Josh McDowell wrote the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict, wildly popular, best-selling book, and Sean rewrote it with him. The newest edition of that book is co-written by Sean McDowell, so Sean McDowell is getting a slice of that extremely profitable book. Captain Cassidy did a number of good articles on Sean McDowell over at Only Sky. She especially critiqued his hawking of an apologetics course for hundreds of dollars. It could even be $1,000 or more if one were to buy the super premium version of the product. I mean, apologetics is a product. Captain Cassidy says, Christianity is a business, and one of the things that it sells is apologetics. And what is apologetics really? It's brain chemicals, it's dopamine, it's cytosine. Apologetics is not to convince us. We think that apologetics is laughable con artistry. It's risibly bad. It's terrible. Apologetics is not to convince us who are outside Christianity. It is to convince the people who are in Christianity. It's to put their mind at ease. It's to reassure them that Christianity is true. Bobby Conway I think Bobby Conway changed the name of his channel to Christianity Still Makes Sense. Who needs to be reassured that Christianity still, that word still, who needs to be reassured that Christianity still makes sense? It is not we ourselves on the outside of Christianity. It is not we who need to be convinced that Christianity is still true. It's the Christians. It's the Christians with doubts. It is their cognitive dissonance that needs to be relieved by these apologists. So, in my view, apologists are really selling brain chemicals to tranquilize the doubts of the people who are already in Christianity. It's got nothing to do with us. So, apologetics is for Christians, it's not for us. And so Captain Cassidy, she writes beautifully about all of this. Go over and read her stuff over at Only Sky. She has a couple of wonderful articles on Sean McDowell, but I remember Sean McDowell, he was discussing something or other with another Christian apologist, and some data had come in from science or perhaps history which goes against a claim of historical fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. And Sean McDowell was asking, how do we amend Christianity so as to account for this new data? As William Lane Craig says, there are always moves that can be made. No matter what evidence comes down the track, there are always moves that can be made. A lot of hubbub was created when William Lane Craig said that if there was one chance in a million that Christianity were true, then it is worth believing in it. That broke the internet, to quote apologia. However, I think that William Lane Craig's interview with Sean McDowell is even more damning than that. Because William Lane Craig essentially admits that Christian apologetics is goalpost shifting. I mean, there are all these moves that can be made is shifting the goalposts. Scientific data comes along which contradicts a claim made by Christianity. Well, there are all these moves that can be made to amend Christianity to fit the new data. That really should have broken the internet, but apart from myself, there has not been really that much counter-apologetic pushback. I wrote several Facebook posts and LinkedIn posts about this. I thought it was absolutely terrible. He essentially said the quiet part out loud. Apologetics is about shifting the goalposts, moves that can be made. But here was Sean McDowell. New data had come down the track. How do we amend Christianity to account for this new data? And he didn't care. You know, he really doesn't care. It's just Christianity's our product. New data has come down the track. How do we amend our product? I mean, it was quite, you know, it's just business. Apologetics is just business. He doesn't care, really, I don't think, whether Christianity is true or not. I mean, it sells, and Sean McDowell is a salesman. That's why he does it. All to say that in Taiwan, one of the children asked him, what do we say to a skeptic who says that the Bible was written by random dudes? And this, of course, got a laugh from the audience. And surprisingly, Pinecreek Doug actually pushed back against this. Pinecreek Doug says, I don't think that the Bible was written by random dudes. Sometimes I think atheists are too afraid to be straw-manned. An example of this is you hate God. The atheists will usually push back against this by saying, I don't hate God, I don't believe in God. However, in my view, a better tactic to employ here is, okay, let's arguendo, Latin for the sake of argument, let us arguendo concede that a classically theistic God exists. Okay, we'll concede that for the sake of argument. There's a list of reasons why we should hate that God. The hatred of God is called misotheism. And there is a chapter in John Loftus's book on horrendous suffering on misotheism. Now, the author of that chapter is in all likelihood an atheist. However, he accepts, for the sake of argument, that a God exists, and then he lists all the reasons why we should hate that God. Drowning children, children being beaten up by their parents, escaping and then being returned to those abusive parents by the police, and then dying. If God exists, he watched all of that and he did not intervene. And that, according to this author, merits our hatred. And I think if an atheist were to go down the misotheism track, that would knock an apologist off script. And I think that good apologetics is about knocking the apologist off script, because that's when the thinking happens. I don't want to give any credibility to Dan Brown. However, in the Da Vinci Code, Sophie is asking Professor Langdon about ritual orgies, and Langdon says the reason why ritual orgies occur is because at the point of orgasm the mind goes completely clear, completely blank. It's like a mindfulness experience, and this, according to Langdon, allows for enlightenment. And in my view, whenever one successfully knocks an apologist off his script, there is a couple of moments where he is disoriented, and the apologetic script running in his mind, it has been thrown out of the window of his mind. And whenever you knock an apologist off script, I think that's when the thinking happens, that's when the enlightenment happens, that's when, you know, an aha moment might occur. And so instead of saying, I don't hate God, I just don't believe in God, instead of, because I mean the apologist expects that, a better tactic, I think, is to go down the misotheism route. Read John Loftus's chapter on misotheism in God and Horrendous Suffering. So yeah, I think that Doug pushed back against the suggestion that the Bible was written by random dudes. I think he pushed back wrongly here. I don't think he should have pushed back against that. We mightn't phrase it that way, but I think the assertion or proposition the Bible was written by random dudes is a mostly accurate proposition. I asked ChatGPT there, I said, according to acceptable critical scholarship, do we know who wrote any of the books of the Old Testament? And ChatGPT didn't say, well, we know who wrote this book, or we know who wrote that book, or we know who wrote the other book. No, it says there are differing theories on who wrote the books of the Old Testament. There are 66 books of the Protestant Bible. There are 3 answers as to who wrote them. There's the fundamentalist answer. The fundamentalist will say, we know who wrote every book in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books, were written by Moses. Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. The Psalms were written by David. Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew, etc., etc., etc. That is the apologetic answer. Then there is the mainstream scholarship answer. And I think the mainstream scholarship answer is, we have no idea really who wrote any of the books of the Old Testament. We can perhaps suggest that Ezra might have written 1 or 2 of them. Or someone very like Ezra might have written 1 or 2 of them. The New Testament, we only know really who wrote 7 books. I think there's 26 or 27 books in the New Testament. We only know who wrote 7 of them. And the 7 books of the New Testament that we know who wrote them are the 7 genuine Pauline epistles. 7 of the epistles written by Paul the Apostle. We are confident that Paul the Apostle actually wrote them. We don't know who wrote Matthew, we don't know who wrote Mark, we don't know who wrote Luke, we don't know who wrote John, we don't know who wrote the book of Acts, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews. There are only 7 books in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, that we know who wrote them. Maybe some fellow named John, about whom we know absolutely nothing historical, but perhaps some fellow named John wrote the book of Revelation, and perhaps he was in Patmos at the time, so maybe the book of Revelation was written by John, but this John character of Patmos, really we know nothing historically about him. So the mainstream scholarship, I think, opinion is that out of the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, we have we know, I mean, in history we don't really know things, but we know, as far as we can know anything about the ancient past, we know who wrote 7 of these books. But then there is the hyper-skeptical opinion, and this is the opinion put forth by Robert Price. And Robert Price says, we don't know who wrote any of the New Testament. There's no good reason to suspect that the 7 Pauline epistles are genuine. And I happen to think that he's correct about that. But I mean, I'm a total amateur, so I'm going to go with the mainstream opinion, even though I favour his opinion. But his opinion is all of the 66 books, we have no idea who wrote any of them. Bart Ehrman's view is that we know who wrote the 7 genuine Pauline epistles. A fellow called Mark might have written the Gospel of Mark, but again, we know nothing historically about this Mark, so it might as well be anonymous. And some fellow named John might have written the book of Revelation, but one thing we know for certain is that he wasn't the Apostle John, he wasn't John the fisherman. So at best, 9 books of the New Testament we kind of sort of know who wrote them. And so let's just suppose that Robert Price is correct, and that we don't know who wrote any of the books of the Old Testament or the New Testament. That kind of sort of sounds as though it was written by random dudes. If we went back into the ancient past, could we locate, let's say we had a time machine and we went back into the ancient past, could we locate the authors of the books of the New Testament or the Old Testament? I don't think we could. If we took a literate Jew at random, he would have as much chance of being the writer of the particular book that we are investigating as any other. So it seems quite random. Pick a literate Jew who can write either Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek composition. Pick a literate Jew at random, and he might as well, for all we know, be the author of the book, of the particular book that we are investigating. And so I do not think that the propositional statement, the Bible was written by random dudes, I don't think that's a false statement. I think that statement is very, very accurate. And Sean McDowell then began to wax lyrical on the beauty and that it's a monument of literature, the most influential book of all time. Hector Avalos said that 99% of the Bible would not be missed. I'm trying to read the Bible at the moment from cover to cover, but I keep getting stuck because it's so repetitive. In the book of Genesis, we have these fictional wars by fictional Old Testament marauders. We have the war of Abraham, and then we get into Exodus, and then all these wars of extermination against rival tribes. And from Exodus up to the Book of Chronicles, apart from the Book of Leviticus, which is a book of ghastly, superstitious blood rituals and animal slaughter, apart from the Book of Leviticus and apart from the short novella, which is the Book of Ruth, it's an extremely tedious, fictitious history that runs from Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, although Numbers I think contains mostly censuses and stuff, but then into Joshua. From Joshua, I mean, what is Joshua? It's a fictitious history of marauders and their fictitious wars, and Joshua right up through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and I'm in 1st Samuel now, and I'm finding it very, very difficult to keep going. I'm just bored. I'm just bored sick of it. And so, as Hector Avalo said, 99% of the Bible would not be missed. In my view, perhaps he's being a little hyperbolic. I think perhaps 5% of the Bible is well written. The Book of Ecclesiastes is a good book. Is a good book. Job is interesting. Psalms can be interesting. There is some interesting literature in there, but most of it, no, it's extremely, extremely boring and tedious, and I've essentially given up trying to read it. And so these were just my thoughts on countering Sean McDowell's assertion that the books of the Bible were not written by random dudes. I think that essentially the books of the Bible were written by random dudes. And even if we concede, for the sake of argument, that the 7 genuine Pauline epistles were actually written by St. Paul, do we know anything historically about St. Paul? No. So even then, the 7 Pauline epistles might as well be anonymous. Like, we have all these details of St. Paul went. I mean, Troy is mentioned in the book of Acts. He went to Troas, which is essentially the hinterland around Troy. Here is St. Paul sailing around the Mediterranean, and he's going to the hinterland around Troy. I mean, it's essentially just the Odyssey or the Iliad. I mean, there's nothing really historical in this book of Acts, and we have St. Paul setting up shop in Rome. I think Seneca was there at the time. Why didn't he write about this? Here we have this famous Jewish preacher under house arrest in Rome. He is going to be tried by the emperor. Why didn't the historians living in Rome at the time write about this? So, I mean, I'm not saying that St. Paul is a fictional character. I'm not a Paul mythicist. St. Paul, in all likelihood, did exist. However, we know nothing historical about him. So, St. Paul essentially is a random dude. We know nothing historical about him. So I think that the assertion that the books of the Bible were written by random dudes, I think that is an accurate assertion. And I think that Pinecreek Doug was a little over hasty in pushing back against that.